Hello, my name is Chris Teutsch and I work at Virginia Tech's Southern Piedmont Research Station located near Blackstone, Virginia. And I'd like to welcome you to Horse Pastures 101. And today we're going to be talking about setting up a small acreage grazing system. When we talk about grazing systems, what we're really talking about is getting in control of grazing. And the way we do that is by setting up a rotational stalking system or a controlled grazing system. And what that allows us to do is to start to manage our grass. If we just have one big continuously grazed pasture, then the people making the management decisions are not us, it's our horses. And they're deciding where to graze and where not to graze. And what you'll notice in a big continuously stocked pasture is that horses have areas that they'll go back to and regraze over and over and over again, and eventually the plants will die within those areas. When we set up a rotational stalking system, we're saying, you've grazed here long enough, we're going to move you to the next paddock. And that's what really helps in maintaining a healthy and vigorous sod in pastures. When we talk about controlled grazing, what we're really doing is managing residual leaf area. And we're rotating based on how much forage is remaining in that pasture, how close that grass has been grazed. And what's important to remember is that we don't want to wait till all the grass is grazed down to a certain height. We want to rotate to the next pasture when the shortest grass in that pasture has reached the designated height for that given forage species. And we want to leave plenty of leaf area. We can kind of think of our pastures as a big solar panel. The more leaf area that we leave, the bigger the solar panel, the more sunlight it's going to capture, the more photosynthesis is going to go on, and the faster that pasture is going to regrow. The closer we graze our pastures, the smaller that solar panel is, and the slower those pastures are going to regrow. So what we're really doing with controlled grazing is managing how close those pastures are grazed or how much residual leaf area we have in those pastures. And we're also managing carbohydrate reserves, and we do that by resting our pastures between grazing events. And when we have a rotational grazing system set up, that allows us to graze a pasture, move them to another pasture, and allow that first pasture to rest. And that's really important because it allows us to maintain a high carbohydrate status in the plant. And carbohydrates are a storage compound that can be used for energy for regrowth and persistence of that pasture. If you haven't had time to watch the forage plant growth and grazing management video, please take time to watch that because it'll really kind of fill the pieces in this whole idea of residual leaf area and carbohydrate reserves within the plant. And then it also allows us to maintain the botanical composition of that pasture. And what I mean by botanical composition is the plant species that are within that pasture. Just by changing how we graze that pasture, we can shift the plant species around. We can favor Bermuda grass or we can favor tall fescue. We can create an environment in which legumes like clover thrive or an environment in which grasses thrive. And the point I want to make is that controlled grazing or grazing management is really a powerful tool in terms of how we can manage our pastures. So, how many paddocks do we need? And when I say paddock is what I'm referring to as a subdivision within a large pasture area. And I'd always like to start out and say that one horse requires 2 to 3 acres of pasture. And this is really a requirement, not an option. And we'll talk more about this in a little bit. Not everybody has 2 to 3 acres. We're going to talk about ways to manage around that and as we go forward with this presentation. I'd like to see people start out with 4 to 6 paddocks. At least 4, 6 is better. And so if we take our large pasture area and we subdivide it into 6 smaller units, that allows us to implement a rotational or a controlled grazing system. And the paddock size is going to depend, of course, on the number of horses that you're trying to graze and your rotation interval. I think one of the most important parts of setting up a small acreage grazing system for horses is to have a sacrifice area. And generally speaking, when we choose that, we want to be well drained, we want to have a low erosion potential, and we want it to be surrounded by a grass buffer. What we use this sacrifice paddock for is to go to when the other paddocks have not regrown, maybe in the summer months when we're under some drought stress and those pastures haven't regrown. And we can go to this sacrifice paddock. They can have some access to the outside. They can feed hay in the sacrifice paddock. And we can save the other paddocks or not overgraze or abuse those other paddocks during stressful periods. So when we lay a grazing system out and we're thinking about dividing our pasture up into these paddocks or smaller pasture subdivisions, there's some things to think about. And one of those is that we want to keep our paddocks as close to square as possible, and we want to avoid regular shapes. And the reason we do that is that we get the best utilization out of a square paddock. If we have a long rectangular paddock, they'll tend to spend more time in one end or the other and not graze that paddock uniformly. If we have paddocks that have sharp angles in them that go to points, we tend not to get as good a utilization in those points as we would in a square paddock. So keep them as close to square as possible. We want them to be as uniform as possible, so we want them to have the same slope and the same aspect and the same forage type and a uniform soil type within a pasture and a uniform production potential. So if we had a hilly area, we wouldn't want to include a flat bottom and a slope in the same paddock because they'll tend to spend more time on that flat area than they will on the hilly area. So making those two separate paddocks would be ideal. So if you can see in this example, we can take this large pasture area and subdivide it just with a few fences here if we had a perimeter fence, and all of a sudden we've got 4 paddocks. We like to see access to fresh water in each paddock, and we can do that by sharing waters across fences. That's a cost-effective way. So instead of having one water per paddock, which would be the ideal situation, we can share it across a fence line, and all of a sudden we've cut the number of waters that we need in half. I like to see animals have access back to shade, and we can do that by putting a shade structure in the different paddocks, maybe just a simple run-in barn that they can get out of the hot sun in the summertime and out of the wind and the snow in the wintertime. Or maybe we give them access with the lane system back to their main barn area. And I'll show you a design where we did that as we finish up this presentation today. All right, so we kind of talked about the ideal situation, but like most people, we don't live in an ideal world. We live in a real world, and we don't always have 2 to 3 acres per horse. And we can't control the weather. We're going to have droughts and we're going to have floods, and neither one is good to be grazing during. But what we can do is we can control grazing, and we do that by subdividing our pastures and implementing rotational stocking. And when we do that, we can manage through weather events, and we can manage around not having quite enough acreage for our horse. Have to have discipline, and we have to have the infrastructure in place to do that, but we can do it. So what do? Subdivide and rotate. And again, start with 4 to 6 paddocks. I think that's a great place to start. And then rotate based on grass height, not on the time period since you've last grazed it, but on that grass height. If we get into the summer months and it's hot and it's dry and the grass hasn't regrown, do not graze that paddock again. Put the animals in the sacrifice area and feed a little bit of hay. And that'll protect all your other pastures. And I got some pictures at the bottom, and you know, we always have this idea in our mind of what a perfect grazing system should look like. Long, big pastures with board fences and so forth, and that's nice, and some people can do that, but most people don't have those kind of resources, and that's an expensive way to fence. There's lots of much more cost-effective fencing options, and especially when we get to interior fencing, a good option is a temporary electric fence made with a piece of poly tape and some step-in posts. Very inexpensive way to subdivide pastures, and very effective. Horses train well to electric fencing. All right, I just wanted to put this table up to talk about starting and stopping grazing heights. And this table shows a bunch of different forage species. And the point I want to make is that there's an ideal height to rotate into that pasture at, and there's an ideal height to stop at. Animals don't graze uniformly, so what we have to do is when we get down to this, say for example, if we're talking about orchard grass and we go in at 8 to 12 inches and they graze it and we get down to that ideal range of 3 to 6 inches, we need to stop when the shortest grass in that pasture is at 3 inches. There'll be lots that's higher than that, but there'll be some areas that are grazed down to 3 inches, and that's when we need to rotate to that next paddock. So what do? We use a sacrifice area, and we can take those animals when that pasture has not regrown and we can feed hay. And that's going to happen during the summer months in many cases. When it gets wet and the animals are causing damage to those pastures, we want to avoid that. So we can put those animals in that sacrifice area during wet conditions. And if we build that sacrifice area correctly, it's going to hold up even during very wet conditions. And we just accept that we're not going to have grass in that sacrifice area. So, and these are a couple nice examples of sacrifice areas that were built along with the housing. Just a little bit about construction of sacrifice area, and there's no really research-based numbers on this. And when I look through different publications available from the Extension Service in different states, you know, there's a range. We need about 600 to 1,000 square feet per horse of sacrifice area. So if you had 4 horses, you'd need 4,000 square feet, between 2,500 and 4,000 square feet. It needs to be well drained with access to the barn. And I think that's important because if it's not easily accessible and it's not close to the barn, then chances are people are not going to use it. So having it associated with that barn is very important. And I'm a strong proponent of installing a hardened surface in there or a rock pad. And I think that's going to be needed, I say in most cases, but I would say in almost all cases that we need really to have that rock pad, because that gives an all-weather surface. Even when it's wet and it's cold and it's sloppy, that will not get sloppy if it's built correctly. And this is an example of how to build that pad. And I like to use a geotextile fabric, and we lay that down over the bare ground. What that geotextile fabric does is it allows water to move through, but it keeps the stone from getting pushed into the wet soil. And that's really important. And the second thing that's important is to put a good 4 to 6 inches of number 4 rock in. And that's larger rock, pieces that are 2 inches, 2 to 3 inches. And that makes a firm base. And then you come back with some kind of topping material, and there's different kinds of topping material you can use. But you want to get something like sifted lime or a crusher run, and that'll kind of fill that number 4 rock in. That number 4 rock gives that pad stability. That topping material gives a nice surface for the horses to walk upon. And if you build this correctly and you've got 8 inches of stone in that pasture over geotextile, you're never going to have a problem with that getting sloppy and muddy within that sacrifice area. And I'd just like to finish things up and talk about, this is a real world system that was installed in Virginia, and this is kind of the little system that we came up with. It's a rotational stocking system on a small acreage. The total acreage of the system is 6 acres. And she's got a little barn here, nothing fancy, just a little barn with 3 or 4 horse stalls in it. And then she's got her water source up by the barn. And then she's got a sacrifice area. And the sacrifice area also serves as a lane to go to these different paddocks. And it's got a hardened surface in it. And when things are wet or dry or she's got to feed hay, then she just closes the gates to the paddocks and the animals stay in that sacrifice area and don't make a mess. She's also incorporated both a warm and a cool season grass into her grazing system. So she's got 4 paddocks of cool season grass, and then she's got 2 paddocks of warm season grass. In this case, it's a Bermuda grass. Those are productive during the summer months, very tolerant of close and frequent grazing of horses, and we'll talk more about that in the Horse Pastures 101 Forage Species video. And then she's got 4 paddocks of cool season grasses that are productive in the spring and the fall. And with that, she's effectively extended her grazing season to include the spring, summer, and fall, and then even into the winter months in some years, depending on how much growth she gets in her cool season grass pastures. So this is a simple system. The animals have access back to the barn and back to shade and water from each one of the paddocks. And all she has to do is simply open or close a gate. Not all systems will look like this. In fact, on your place, the system may be quite different. But this is a nice example to help you start to think about how to set up a grazing system on your farm. And the final thought that I want to leave you with is that proper pasture management is good for the horse owner. It's good for the pasture sod, it's good for the animal, and it's good for the environment. And we need to be working towards that. As an industry, horse people really need to think about the environment, because if we don't, someone is going to help us think about it, and that means regulation, and we really don't want that to happen if we don't have to have it. The last thing I want to say is that cooperative extension is a tremendous resource for you, and if you haven't visited with your local extension agent, then you need to get with them and talk to them about setting up a small acreage horse system, and they will help you. Virginia Cooperative Extension and Cooperative Extension in other states is a tremendous resource for horse owners, and it's tremendously underutilized by horse owners. So if you don't know about extension, just search Cooperative Extension in the name of your state, and it'll bring up a web page for your state, which will give you your local resources. And I encourage you to use those local resources. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you again when you view another Horse Pastures 101.